Great.
Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. I am Claudia Silk, Adult Services Librarian at the Fairfield Public Library. Our partnership with the Fairfield League of Women Voters is very important to us. We share a mission to engage, inspire, and educate. We're particularly proud of the Fairfield chapter for their vibrancy, dedication, and hard work in bringing these wonderful programs to the public. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Bryce Perry, the Fairfield chapter co-president.
Thank you, Claudia. And once again, I really would like to thank you and the Fairfield Public Library that is such a collaborative partner and have given us the opportunity to reach out and expand our programs, our bases, and the people that are able to watch. So again, thank you so much. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization of women and men, Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated voters, that's dedicated to information, education, and participation in all things related to our democratic process. But to participate, it's really important that you're informed. And that's why these programs and your participation this evening is so important to us. So, thank you all. And we are so proud to offer such an impressive panelist of experts. So really, thank you for being with us. Joining us this evening are Judd Choate, Director of the Division of Elections for the Department of the State of Colorado, Anna Kellar, Executive Director of Democracy, Maine, Catherine Turcer, Executive Director of Common Cause, Ohio, and Andrew Garber, who not only is going to present for us tonight, but has agreed to be our moderator. So thank you. You're all in good hands with that. Andrew is a fellow within the Brennan Center's Voting Rights and Elections program. Prior to that, he was a litigation associate, and he's a graduate of Villanova University and Columbia Law School. During law school, he served as a clerk to Senator Chris Coons and an intern to Judge Paul, I'm not going to say this right, Garber, and an intern in the bill drafting unit of the New York City Council's legislative department. So what do you do like in your spare time? So, but anyway, thank you very, very much. I appreciate not only that you're all presenting, but Andrew, particularly that you'll moderate for us. So I'll turn it over to you and thank you all.
Thank you very much, Bryce and Claudia and everyone from the League of Women Voters. It's great to be here amongst such a fantastic panel. I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm just going to give a start with a little overview of kind of where voting rights and elections stand in our country right now, and then I'll turn it over to our other panelists to give their thoughts and perspectives. But the key takeaway that I'm going to start with is not the brightest of news. It's that our democracy really is under attack right now, and voting rights are under attack. Elections are under partisan attack as well, and we need to be active and we need to be vigilant and not take things for granted. But at the same time, there are opportunities to expand voting rights and democratic rights, and we should be excited about those as well. So I want to highlight two key areas of concern and then a couple of opportunities before I turn it over. The first concern relates to the rollback of voting rights, which is something we've been seeing in our country over the last couple of decades, really. It's accelerated a lot since the 2020 election, and since the start of 2021, 18 states have passed 34 laws that restrict access to voting. And some of these might be a little more minor, they make it a little harder to vote by mail, or they might close a few polling places, but some of them are also really expansive and significant. For example, 4 different states, Texas, Georgia, Florida, and Iowa, all passed omnibus, or what I sometimes call monster voter restriction bills in 2021 that were designed to do all sorts of things, death by 1,000 cuts, take away voting opportunities in a way that seems small individually, but can have a big impact in the aggregate. Particularly concerning is how these rollbacks are discriminatory. They consistently target voters of color. And one of the ways we see this is how they respond to the 2020 election. So for example, in Texas, they passed this bill, SB 1 last year. In 2020, minority voters in urban areas in Texas really took advantage of things like voting by mail, early voting. And in Harris County, where Houston is, there was some 24-hour voting. And wouldn't you know it, the Texas legislature gets together the following year and they cut back on mail voting. They make it harder to vote by mail. They eliminate 24-hour voting. They shorten early voting periods. These things aren't coincidences. These legislatures know what they're doing, and far too often they are targeting voters of color. Part of the problem and part of the reason we've seen this rollback of voting rights is that courts have really fallen back from their longstanding role as a rights protector. And we've seen this in a few different areas, and voting rights is unfortunately one of them. It didn't necessarily start in 2013, but we really saw the floodgates open in 2013 with the Supreme Court's decision in Shelby County v. Holder. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 is one of the greatest pieces of legislation our country's ever seen. And one of the things it did was it required states and localities with histories of voter discrimination to receive federal pre-clearance before they could implement changes to their voting laws. The system worked fantastically. It was a pretty efficient system, all things considered, and allowed voters of color to make great strides until 2013, when the Supreme Court decided we didn't need it anymore, that the provision had done everything it needed to, and it was now unconstitutional to impose this burden on the states. Unfortunately, as I said, this really opened the floodgates. Within months, states were passing really strict voter ID laws. North Carolina passed a voter ID law a couple months later that a federal court said targeted minority voters with surgical precision. Last year, the Supreme Court really doubled down on this in a case called Brnovich v. DNC. They rolled back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Section 2 allows people or the government to bring lawsuits and say that a law denies someone the right to vote, makes it harder for someone to vote, or redistricting has diluted the voting power of a group. And the court last year basically rewrote Section 2 to make it much harder to win those lawsuits, which is extraordinarily unfortunate and will have real impacts on people trying to vindicate their rights. And I'll just mention quickly that the Supreme Court has not been alone. Some of the lower federal courts have aided and taken this jurisprudence further. There's a Supreme Court case called Purcell, which basically says courts shouldn't be changing election rules right before an election. And in the original case, it was 15 days before the election that a rule was changed. Lower courts and even the Supreme Court now are starting to impose this Purcell limitation months out. And elections in November, and they're saying May or June, it's too close to the election. We can't, even if there's an issue, we can't change the rule. And so that's a big concern because it means there's now a much narrower time frame in which people can vindicate their voting rights in court. The second issue I want to highlight for everyone, equally important, relates to election interference. So election interference is when partisan actors interfere with elections or they manipulate the outcome, the counting process, who's running the elections, who's counting the votes. This year alone, 6 states have passed 9 election interference laws. And these range from everything like laws that change who's able to certify an election or allow for the submission of competing slates in a presidential election. Sometimes election interference bills might replace nonpartisan actors with partisan ones. They might impose biased audits or things that are called audits that are nothing like audits at all. They might penalize or criminalize election officials for minor mistakes. These are all major concerns and make it harder to run elections and easier for people to manipulate the outcome. As one example for you, last year, Georgia passed the omnibus voting bill I mentioned, SB 202, and one of the things it did is it changed who was in charge of the state election board from the Secretary of State to someone appointed by the legislature, obviously a partisan body. And equally concerningly, it made it so the state legislature could remove county election boards and replace them with people chosen by the legislature. Sometimes we've seen election interference and even the rollback of voting rights become a political platform. You may have seen in Pennsylvania, the Republican nomination for governor was won by someone whose platform, in a lot of cases, involves saying he wouldn't have certified the 2020 election. He wants to make it harder to certify the 2024 election. And I'll pause to emphasize the Brennan Center is nonpartisan. I know the Legal and Voters is as well. That's not to comment on any outcome of the election, but just to note that it is a real concern that we are seeing candidates pop up who want to make election interference easier. As I said, though, there are some good opportunities. The gold standard is always going to be comprehensive federal legislation. For those following might have seen earlier this year, 2 really important bills, the Freedom to Vote Act and the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, both passed the House, came very close to passing the Senate. They were held up by the filibuster. So that was disappointing to see, but there are a lot of great reforms in there in both bills that should remain on the front burner and should continue to be advocated for. And I'll mention as well, Congress is looking into revising the Electoral Count Act, which has been a lot in the news again these last few days with the January 6th committee hearings. But there are opportunities in revising the Electoral Count Act, both to improve and safeguard the process of counting the presidential elector votes, but also to put in some additional rail guards against states that are trying to roll back voting rights or allow for increased election interference. And so hopefully something good comes out of that. Also, while I've highlighted that there are a lot of states where we're concerned about what they're doing, there are states that are doing great things and really leading the way in voting rights and being models of how elections can and should be run. Just as one quick example, and I hope we'll get to hear some others tonight, the New York legislature just passed a state voting rights act that looks to crack down on counties and localities that are putting in place any discriminatory practices. Every reason to believe the governor will sign that soon, and hopefully other states will follow suit. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Judd Choate. He is the state elections director for Colorado. In 2017, he was the president of the National Association of State Election Directors. Prior to joining the Department of State in Colorado, he practiced election law at a Denver firm. He served as a law clerk to a Colorado Supreme Court justice as well. He had a good career before law school, though. He was a professor of political science at the University of Nebraska, where he taught courses on campaigns and elections. And he's authored a book and peer-reviewed articles on political behavior. He is a JD from Colorado Law School, a PhD and MA in political science from Purdue. And it looks like before he got into all the elections work, he was a scout for the Kansas City Royals, which I'm sure will interest any baseball fans in the crowd. With that, I'll turn it over.
That's what everybody wants to know about that. They always ask those questions. So, all right. So let me show you. I'm going to kill you with a whole bunch of slides here. So my apologies before you're inundated with data. So let me share my screen. Let's see, share and. All right, so you guys should see that. That's me. If you want to take a picture of that or do a screenshot of that screen, then you'll have my contact information. Feel free to give me a call, drop me a line. I'm always happy to answer questions related to elections in Colorado, where I have a little bit of expertise, but I can also help you sort of generally on legal topics and policy topics related to elections, because, you know, that's when you're in one state, you're kind of familiar with what every state's doing. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about Colorado's election model. So Andrew was just talking about some great improvements that it sounds like New York's doing. There are some states that are going the other way. So there are the states that are really struggling, that are making bad policy decisions, and doing things which really restrict voting. And then there are states like Colorado, which are making strides in the other direction. It's actually kind of a problem. I'll go off script a little bit. It's kind of a problem in US elections, which is very quickly for you lawyers out there, creating a bit of a 14th Amendment situation where it's so hard to vote in one state, but it's so easy to vote in another state that at some point that becomes an equal protection issue. And so, you know, a lawyer better than me should be out there figuring out how to file those claims, because it really is weird how we're going in such different directions. But Colorado's going in a good direction. So I'll talk about some things that are related or perhaps unrelated to Connecticut and some of the things that you guys do in your local elections. So let me talk first about voter reg. In Colorado, we have a number of different methods in which you register to vote. You either register by paper or electronic. That's the mode. But most of our registrations come through electronically. We have online voter registration. We have automatic voter registration. I noticed that Connecticut has both of those. We can also register to vote online with only a Social Security number, because we have a direct connection into the Social Security Administration database. So we can check somebody's identity and verify their identity through that Social Security portal. That's one of the ways that I think you can make online voter registration even better than using people's driver's license, because you all know your Social Security number off the top of your head, but you don't know, or typically wouldn't know, I know because I do it occasionally, your driver's license number. So for that reason, it's just kind of a better way to do it. There's also I won't go into what the MVRA is, but it's the National Voter Registration Act, and it has a whole bunch of very important pieces. In fact, it's really the most important federal law that's ever been passed related to voting and elections. So lots of people like to talk about the VRA, the Voting Rights Act. The NVRA, the National Voter Registration Act, is actually really where the important federal regulations about voting and list maintenance and who can be registered and under what conditions, that's where a lot of that is in federal law. And then you can see the other ways in which you register to vote there. Those are all become less and less minor or important as you go down the list. Automatic voter registration, it's a thing in Colorado. If you go into a DMV, we're going to register you to vote if you're eligible. So if you meet those criteria at the top, and that information is going to automatically be used to register you to vote. So we're not going to ask your permission. We're not going to even talk about voting or elections in that interaction that we have with somebody that's getting their driver's license. We're just going to use that data to register you. And then we send you a mailing later on, like a week later, that says, hey, when you were in the DMV the other day and you became a license holder in Colorado, we use that information to register you to vote. Because under our state law, and frankly, under pretty much every state law, the same elements that allow you to become a driver's license holder are the same things that you need to be a registered voter. So if you're doing one, all the things for the other apply. So that means the address is the same, that means your residency is the same, all of that stuff should apply, and that's why those two things work together so well. Connecticut has this, although they have the in-person version of it. So they are asking the questions. They are doing it in real time with the person standing in front of them. We do it completely back end, where we're not even having that conversation. We just do it whether you want it or not. And then you can always say, hey, I didn't want to do that, in which case we'll cancel your registration. There you can see Connecticut's on there, but a number of other states are on there. These are the automatic voter registration states in the US as of 2021. I don't think that's changed. I think that's the group. Maine is well represented on this call, by the way, and so maybe you'll hear more about Maine and their work there. Automatic voter registration is great because it's even. You know, throughout month to month, you're getting registrations that are about the same across time. So elections officials, myself and those people that work in our counties or in townships in your state, they really struggle with the fact that there's these big pushes that are right before elections. And those are about behavior on the part of the voter or behavior by VRDs and others that operate in the space. However, if you are doing these things automatically, you can level off that behavior, and you can see that it happens every month pretty regularly, and you can use your personnel and manage your resources well. So that's really important. Online voter registration, again, Colorado is one of these. We were the third state in the country to have online voter registration. Connecticut's also one of these. A lot of states are, I think we're at 42 now, plus the District of Columbia. You'll see those states that are the outliers. Those are the outliers on a lot of things. Texas, they run elections in a very, not voter-friendly way. Wyoming, my friends to the north, somewhat the same. Some of the southern states, the same. Oops, sorry, Maine. Hopefully you guys will come around to online voter registration. Here are the numbers related to online. So remember where I said AVR was nice and steady? Well, here is the bounce that happens related to elections. So in 2020, you can see that we had a presidential primary on March 3rd of 2020. So you can see the peak right before the presidential primary. Then we had a state primary that was at the end of June in 2020. So you see the peak there. And then we had a November general election, obviously a very big election. And so you can see the peak in September and October. That's all voter initiated activity. When you take it out of the hands of your voters and you just update it, then you can, steady that activity a lot. If we did not have automatic voter registration, these numbers would have been exponentially higher because it would have required a lot more activity on the part of the voter. All right, and a couple of little voter reg data that I kind of thought you might be interested in. Colorado used to be an even state. We were purple. We were as purple as you could get, especially in 2008. In 2012, we were dead even in terms of Democrats and Republicans. But over the last couple of years, these last couple of cycles, you can see that we have pivoted hard to the left. We are now pretty significantly Democratic or even unaffiliated. And the Republican number, which is that one in the middle, has gone from 37% in 2014 to only 25% of our electorate now in 2022. While the Democratic number is pretty steady, the unaffiliated numbers rocketed up, and but a lot of those unaffiliateds are trending to the left. So we've become more of a Democratic state. By the way, just as a note, I have worked for 4 secretaries. I've been in this job for 13 years. Somehow I've made it to 13 years. And my first boss was a Democrat. My next 2 were Republicans, and now I work for another Democrat. So somehow I've survived. But those, we have sort of gone back and forth, but all the time we have instituted policies to prioritize and increase voter registration. And voter registration for us means we're leaning left. So you might wonder where Colorado falls nationally. So this is from the EPI. So if you are in front of your computer right now, well, you have to be because you're looking at me. But if you want to go to another page, you can put in EPI, that's Elections Performance Index. And it comes out of the MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So if you put in EPI MIT, the first thing that's going to come up is the EPI, and you can look through the EPI and sort of see how other states are doing or Connecticut's doing on various parts, various things that we do. One of them is voter registration rate. So you can see Colorado's right there in the middle. We're really the light state there. It's because we are the 4th one on the far right-hand bottom table. And we're registered at 92.4%. So our state is registered at over 90%. That means that 92 out of 100 people that are eligible in the state of Colorado are registered to vote. We're pretty proud of that. And the reason why we're so high is because we've sort of adopted the all-in approach. We do every single thing we can think of to get people registered to vote. And you can see all of those things listed there. Online voter registration, ERIC, which I'll talk about here in a second. We adopted same-day registration in 2013, so you can register to vote and vote the same day. We have pre-registration. We do a lot of jail voting and jail registration. We have full back-end AVR, which gets a lot of people registered. And then, we're a vote by mail state, or more accurately stated, a mail ballot state. And that means that everybody who's registered and is active in our registration database gets a ballot in the mail. And turns out, if you hand deliver a ballot to somebody's home, there's a much greater likelihood that they will actually vote that ballot because of the ease by which we provide that ballot and they can get it back. All right, so let me talk about the election timeline and the various things you have to do. So you're probably familiar with this, but we have a UOCAVA deadline. UOCAVA stands for Uniform Overseas Citizens Absentee Voting Act. It was passed in 1986, and then MOVE was passed in 2009. MOVE requires that ballots go out 45 days prior to a general election or an election with a federal office. So very important to get ballots out early. For us, we're in the middle of a primary right now, so UOCAVA voters are voting their mail ballots right now. But that's the first sort of big domino to fall in the election timeline. And then in Colorado, we're going to send out ballots to all of our registered voters 22 days prior to election day, unless there's a holiday on that 22nd day. Turns out there almost always is. It's kind of a funky quirk of our calendar. So often we're sending those out about 25 days prior to the election. And then there are 3 ways in which people can return those ballots. They can either drop them at a drop box, they can mail them back, or they can drop them in person. And then they can vote in person. So there's actually 4 ways to vote, 3 ways to return. And I'll talk to you a little bit about the way that this looks. So here are the number of drop boxes that some of our largest counties have. Denver is our largest county, but just barely. So, and you can see that they have 38 drop boxes. Most of the other counties there are in the 30s or 20s. And there is a requirement that there be a drop box per voter in each one of our counties. And so you can see that we average a drop box around every 12,000 voters. And so there's lots of drop boxes around Colorado. I can walk to one, it's about 6 blocks away. If I walk this way, I can walk about a mile. And there's another drop box. They're all over the place. And I live in Denver. We also do ballot tracking. This is where, as your ballot goes out, you get a notification, hey, your ballot's in the mail. And then when you fill your ballot in and then send it back, when it gets back to the county, they notify you, hey, we got your ballot. And then the last one is when the ballot has been approved for counting and will be counted. So those notifications go out. We signed up automatically 44% of our population in before the 2020 election, and 52% ultimately got signed up. So 8%, got the news and they signed up themselves. So we have a large percentage of people that get these tracking notifications. Really seems to help with notification. You might be interested how we do mail ballot verification. It's kind of a pretty straightforward process, but basically a bipartisan team look at each ballot, they look at the signature on the back of the envelope, they compare it to the signature on file, and that ballot is accepted for counting if those signatures match. That's pretty much the way it works. If for whatever reason we can't match those up, or maybe the signature is missing, we have a process that we use to cure those. This is the percentage, by the way. I had a lot of fun making this graphic. 99% of ballots were counted. Of that small percentage of counted ballots we had to reject, you can see most of them were signature discrepancies. So signatures that we couldn't reconcile with the signature that was on file. If you were curious, hey, I wonder who are the people who are most likely to get their ballots rejected? Well, it turns out in 2020, it was largely based on age. The younger you were, the more likely your ballot was to be rejected. Chances are that's because your signature is changing. You don't understand that you actually have to do a real signature on the back of the envelope, and it has to match the one that's on your driver's license. And so over time, older voters do better at that. Just out of curiosity, I pulled up the 2018 numbers. See if you can see the difference. 2020. Oops. There we go. 2018. 2020. 2018. Turns out it's always this way. The young voters are more likely to have their ballots rejected, unfortunately. You can vote in person in the state of Colorado. We open what we call VSPCs, voter service and polling centers. Frankly, we don't get a lot of people that vote in person, but we have what's called a vote center siting tool. So again, if you were in front of your computer, if you typed in vote center siting tool and put in Colorado, you would see that we have this way of sort of helping our counties to select where to put their polling places and their drop boxes. We can also ask them to put drop boxes in certain locations based on the criteria that's set up in that vote center siting tool. We have a formula for where to put those and under what conditions. And then you can see here that about 195,000 people voted in person at a VSPC. Not very many, less than 6% of our state population. And most of those people ended up voting a paper ballot. There were some people that voted on the ballot marking devices, which produce paper. So we have paper for every counted ballot in the state. It's just if you voted on the screen or if you voted paper. And then this was our activity that was related to VSPCs. You can see that most of it happens on election day or the day before. All right, so I was asked to mention that we do risk limiting audits. So let me talk to you a little bit about that. Turns out a whole bunch of stuff happens after election day. So from election day to 9 days after, we're doing all sorts of things. And one of those things is risk limiting audit. So what is a risk limiting audit? This is where we audit the outcome of an election by doing a one-to-one comparison of ballots that are randomly selected for a given county. based on how close the race was in that county. So we pull a number of ballots randomly, and we know how the scanner scanned each one of those ballots. And we compare the scanned image to the image of the actual physical ballot that the judges, the bipartisan team, have in their hands. And then they have to input that information into a spreadsheet. And we compare that at the end of the election to make sure that those numbers align. Turns out over the course of the last 7 elections in which we've used this, we've never had a scanned ballot that was scanned incorrectly. Every single ballot was scanned correctly. We've had a couple of human errors where the humans look at a ballot and they say it's a Biden vote, but it was actually a Trump vote, or it was a Trump vote, but it was actually a Biden vote. We've had that happen before, but we've never had the scanner get it wrong. So when people are worried about scanners, they really shouldn't be. A couple of other things, I'll just go through this. I wanted to show you some interesting data from the 2020 election. That was our turnout by active registered voters. You can see actually Republicans had a higher turnout in our state than the other 2 parties, or party and unaffiliated. They just didn't have as many voters. And so that's why Donald Trump lost so handily in Colorado. That's percentage. And this is turnout by age. And then here's comparing Colorado to the rest of the country. If anybody ever comes to you, or you think to yourself, hey, people aren't engaged in elections in the United States, and people are, they don't want to be involved in elections, and elections are going down the tubes. That's not true. Actually, we had the turnout in 2020 that was the highest one since 1900. So we have a very engaged populace right now. Very good turnout, and a lot of people on all sides are interested. And then I went ahead and pulled this and put Connecticut on it so you get a sense of where you fell. This was the eligible voter turnout by state in 2020. And you can see here that Minnesota had the highest in the United States. Colorado was second, and Maine was third, and Connecticut was 16th, which I put on there at 71.5. So pretty good, but not quite as good as some of the other states that were in the queue there. There's the whole list of every US state. You can see Connecticut right there at 16, and the rest of US states. All right, so I won't bore you with more slides. So why don't I give up the screen here and let you go. And I'm here to answer any questions if you have anything. So.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was a really great and informative presentation. One thing I really liked about it is so often we hear about the negative happening around elections, and I'm guilty of that too. So often I'm trying to let people know about what's going on and the challenges we face, but it's really important to remember as well that there are positive steps being taken, and throughout the country, there's so many great people who are just trying to implement the laws and make sure everyone can vote, and they can vote conveniently, safely. You heard how secure Colorado's elections are, so that's really, really great to hear. I want to move on to our other panelists for time, but one other thing I'd be potentially interested in hearing more about later when we do questions. You talked about how automatic voter registration caused a level off in when people register to vote, and that avoids some of the rush that comes around election season. Of course, we know election officials at the state and especially the local level face a lot of resource challenges, and there's only so many people. So I'm curious what other kinds of regulations maybe Colorado has, or you wish Colorado has, to make it easier on election officials throughout the year. So maybe that's something we can revisit.
I will ponder that and have my answer ready.
Appreciate it. It's not always obvious to those of us that don't run an election, kind of those downstream positive effects. But for now, let's turn to Anna Kellar. They are Executive Director of Democracy Maine. Anna's education and experience with democracy and anti-corruption campaigns in Eastern Europe and Central Asia increased their commitment to preserve and strengthen civil society and grassroots democracy in Maine. They worked at Maine Citizens for Clean Elections in 2014 as an organizer on the Clean Elections Initiative. In 2016, they ran for state legislature, and in 2017 were appointed the first joint executive director for Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine. Anna has a BA in political science from Yale University and an MA in conflict studies from London School of Economics. Please take us away.
Thank you. And it's quite an act to follow to go after Judd talking about Colorado. I will try not to be too competitive, but all of those places that says we don't, the things that said we didn't have online voter registration and AVR, we've passed them all. They're just not all into effect yet. So Maine is actually catching up a lot in the last couple of years. But I will try not to be too defensive about the fact that our EPI score does not reflect 3 things we passed last year yet. I'm going to put up some slides and be able to share that with you. But first I'll just mention, so Democracy Maine is a partnership between the League of Women Voters of Maine, Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, and Maine Student Votes, are 3 organizations that are all working to improve our democracy and make it easier for people to vote. We are not a merger, but we do have all shared staff and behind the scenes collaboration among the three of us. And so thinking about how, different ways of being collaborative, different ways of being creative at the states, we have also really benefited over the last 5 years from bringing a lot of democracy advocates together in one place. I'm having a little trouble screen sharing. I'm going to try one more time here and see if I can get this to work. There we go. So what I'm going to talk about is how states and cities can be a laboratory of democracy. And this is something that I think fits nicely both with the great sort of example of how Colorado is taking so many best practices and creating an election model that we'd all like to copy, as well as the conversation that we had and are going to have about the threats facing our democracy. This is the flip side of the 2 sides of the conversation that we have between states that are making it harder to vote, states that are making it easier to vote. Most countries don't have the system that we have, where our elections are controlled at the state and in some cases local levels. They set one federal system and that's how things go. And while I think we would hopefully all agree here that there's benefits to having a minimum standard for elections and a floor that would be set and protected through federal legislation and the courts, there's also an advantage in some ways to the power of our states and cities to experiment and to try out new ways of involving more people in our democracy. So, as you may or may not know, Maine's motto is Dirigo, and Mainers are really always very happy when we can say that we're leading the country on something other than being the easternmost state. And so we like to think of ourselves as leading the way in elections. As you saw, we were 3rd in voter turnout in 2020, so not quite leading, but always one of the top few states. And so what I want to talk about here is, to what degree is Maine actually leading in the places where we're maybe out ahead of the curve, as well as some of the places where we're rushing to catch up. Some of the things that have been successful and that Maine has been doing that we would hope other states will follow on with. So Maine has a system like Connecticut does of statewide public funding for candidates. Maine passed ours, the first statewide system, in 1996. I got involved in a grassroots citizen initiative to strengthen that system after the Supreme Court decisions and Citizens United and subsequent decisions weakened it. both times very strong public support, and Maine has a high rate of participation, typically well over 60% of state legislative candidates use our clean election system. And that means that they are not taking money from special interests. They are raising a small amount of money from their constituents and then receiving public funds to run the rest of their campaign. And we have seen that has increased access to running for office for people who might otherwise be excluded from it. If we could get the legislators better paid, we know that would go up even more, but at least they're not needing to be wealthy in order to run for office in the first place. And talking about cities, I'm also leading a campaign to bring a system of public funding to the municipal level in Portland, Maine, where the cost of running for office has really skyrocketed in the last 10 years. And as the city gentrifies and becomes a very hot place for people to move to, there have been increasing conflicts over development, over many of areas around local politics, and with that, an increased spending. And so we're looking to have on the ballot this November, after a long process, that at the local level. So that's an example in Maine where other cities did it around the country. New York City had it. Maine passed it for the first time on a state level. And then now we're looking at where else this policy can be useful at a local level. With ranked choice voting, it's a little bit of the opposite situation. The city of Portland passed a ranked choice voting law for mayor in 2010 and used it in 2011. We had 15 candidates. And then at the state level, we passed ranked choice voting in 2016. The legislature tried to repeal a part of it. We had a successful people's veto campaign to put it back. And we've used it since 2018 for our federal races in the general election and for state level races in the primary. We also have seen the expansion of ranked choice voting at the municipal level in Maine. So Portland expanded to all municipal offices in 2020 by 86% of the vote, by the way. And Westbrook, the neighboring city, has passed a bill to use ranked choice voting for its municipal elections last November. And as we're seeing more interest around the state, it has really brought forward the potential benefits of this policy to many different types of communities. But we've also seen other states and cities consider this. I know Connecticut has had discussions about it, and it's been a really interesting experience for us to be on this, once again, on this cutting edge of reform. Both of these policies, I want to say, are very much about democracy and expanding who has access to political power and political equity in our country. They're also indirectly about increasing voter turnout. And when we talk about what the barriers are to voting, it's not only voter suppression tactics as a threat to voting rights in those most basic sense of barriers to voting. It's also whether people feel like they have good choices who are running, that they can vote for the candidates that they like the best, and have those candidates' votes matter, that when people are in office, they'll actually listen to them and not to their donors. All of those sources of cynicism that certainly have a basis in voters' real experience all go into depressing voter turnout. And so we see things like clean elections and ranked choice voting as a part of how Maine continues to build our voter turnout and to make sure all of those votes really matter and we have a truly representative democracy as well. Two other areas that Maine likes to be proud of. We were one of the first states to have same-day voter registration, and we still do, despite an attempt to repeal it in 2011. We collected the signatures and went back out and did a people's veto and kept it through the vote of Maine people. So as you're seeing a theme here, Maine voters really across party lines don't like to be told that how they're voting isn't good enough and that they want to keep expanding voting rights. And so we've had very successful ballot initiatives, both expanding voting rights and defending the ones that we've had. And another way that Maine, I could say, leads, but really here just hasn't done the bad things that other states have, that Maine and Vermont are the only two states where if you're incarcerated, you don't lose your voting rights. So people in prison in Maine can vote by absentee ballot in the community where they last had their residence. And that is something that I think we're very proud of. And as we look at efforts around the country to restore voting rights, this is something that Maine's experience in, we think, can be helpful, again, to other states. So those are all places, you know, that we have a lot of pride in, and we can say that we're leading, and we'd like to be able to support other states in making those choices with the experience we've had in campaigning for them and implementing them and defending them. But we also have to admit the places where we're not there yet in terms of the goals that we have. So our EP score is not as good as Colorado's. And the big part of the reason why is that they have us missing three very important things: online voter registration, automatic voter registration, and post-election ballot audits and risk limiting audits. Fortunately, in the last 2 to 3 years, Maine has actually passed all of those laws. And so we will be lagging no longer. Automatic voter registration goes into effect actually next week. We're very excited. And online voter registration will go into effect early in 2024, before the 2024 election. We'll be piloting risk limiting audits in the next couple of years, and again, expanding that in time for 2024. So very excited to see the progress that we've been able to make. And in a lot of ways, the 2020 election was a real wake-up call for Mainers and Maine election administrators at just how fragile some of our systems are. We have strong voting rights, but if those weren't backed up by the technology and the logistics and the administration to ensure that those rights would actually get delivered fairly across the state, you know, that doesn't do us much good. So, for example, online voter registration got a really big boost when suddenly we realized that people were not going to be able to go into their town office to go register to vote, or register day of at the polling place if they needed to vote by mail because of COVID. And so while we were able to come up with some creative ways to still help people and reach people who needed that voter registration, it was a big boost for why online was so important. One of the other areas that Maine really struggles with, and something that we see as a barrier that we're going to need to overcome in order to be able to really do a full vote by mail program proactively the way Colorado does, is that we have 540 municipalities, all of which administer their own elections. And when it comes to municipal elections, set their own schedule, mail out their own ballots, have a totally separate system for requesting an absentee ballot. And where we could see the benefit in so many ways of that proactive mail out the ballot without needing to request it would go into effect in local elections. That's when people might not be paying attention and we're getting the ballot in the mail could make a big difference in terms of whether they turn out. So we want to make sure that those municipal elections aren't left behind. And that's going to involve investing in technology through the Secretary of State and out to the clerks. And it's going to mean really building out the relationships and the culture between these local election administrators, the Secretary of State, outside technical experts, and all of that. And we've made a lot of progress in the last couple of years, but there's a lot of work still to be done there just to get ourselves up into the technological standard to be able to do some of these more advanced systems. The other thing that we look at and really don't feel too proud of ourselves is how deep the divisions can be between different parts of the state when it comes to voter turnout. And when we look at those disparities, they also tend to match onto voter poverty and racial demographics. So I'm just going to show you this graph. We have up at the highest voter turnout in 2020, the House district in Falmouth, Maine, where I grew up. It's a wealthy suburb of Portland, had 86% voter turnout. Where I live now, in one of the more densely populated and diverse parts of Portland, the turnout was barely over 50%. And so here, poverty rate calculated by the number of people on food assistance and the voter turnout rate have a pretty strong correlation. And so as we've looked at this information and thought about what we can be doing about it, it's not enough for us just to be passing better statewide laws and implementing them better. We want to make sure that our advocacy work also is matched with our community education work and reaching out to these parts of the state. And so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I'm happy to talk later on, or if anybody's interested in hearing, in the audience would like to hear more about any of the programs that we've been doing. We've been building a lot of partnerships in those communities that have that lowest voter turnout to go door to door and knock on every voter's door and talk to them about elections, and do that year in and year out to start building a community of voting. We have voter information. We're working with lots of different community partners to expand access in those places. And like I said, we also see structure reform as an important piece of how voters are motivated to get out and vote, and that if you are someone who's living in poverty and your experiences of government may be fairly negative or feel like you haven't been heard, that's going to impact your sense of, being a valued person in the system. And so as we think about overcoming barriers to voting, it can't just be, do people have access, but do people feel like their votes are going to matter? And so that culture is an equally important piece. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much. That's really great and informative. And I really appreciate how you talk a lot about the statewide policies, but also remind us towards the end there, even when good things are happening statewide, there's so many different people and perspectives in state, and something that kind of writ large seems great. It's going to be good for everyone, might not interact with everyone in the community the same way, and we have to be mindful of that. So I appreciate it at the end, and it's great to see that Maine's been a leader on a lot of pro-voter reforms and is catching up on some others as well. But for now, let's turn the floor over to Catherine Turcer, the Executive Director of Common Cause Ohio, a grassroots organization devoted to open and accountable government. As a public interest lobbyist, Catherine promotes access to the ballot and open government at the Ohio State House. She coordinated Fair Districts, or Fair Elections Coalition, which led to successful redistricting reforms in the state legislature. That was in 2015, and again for Ohio's congressional maps in 2018. Catherine was the director of Ohio Citizen Action's Money and Politics Project for 15 years. In 2006, she received the Spirit of Democracy Award from the Ohio Secretary of State. That is fantastic. Take us away.
Hi, everybody. Hello from the Buckeye State. So I'm going to tell you a long tale of how hard it was for us to do redistricting reform. And then when we finally were implementing some of the challenges. And, I picked out this picture because I thought, it's important to think about how when it comes to creating voting districts, we do it differently across the country. But we now live in a country where 1 in 5 Americans live in states with independent citizens commissions. Now, Ohio has elected officials doing the map making with rules in place. But I'm going to take us back a little ways. we actually have this really long history of redistricting reform. So, when you start to think about kind of one person, one vote, when all of a sudden there were rules about making sure that the voting districts were the same size, because we were a swing state, it was pretty clear early on, that things weren't quite right. I mean, clearly the maps were gerrymandered, or things would be more even-steven between Democrats and Republicans. And in fact, the first effort that we had was in 1981. This was one that was really championed by the League of Women Voters of Ohio. And there was this wonderful woman named Joan Lawrence, who later became a state legislator and was the head of the Department of Aging under Governor Taft. And she really took it on and is 90 some at this point and continues to be a really good advocate for fair voting districts. And in 1981, this effort failed. When we think about how hard it is to go up against those in power, it becomes really challenging to address the need to create fair districts. And so in 1981, the Republicans supported the redistricting reform effort and the Democrats opposed it. Of course, things really changed. So one of the things I started working on redistricting reform in like the late 90s. I was invited by this wonderful woman named Terry McCoy, who was a part of the League of Women Voters of Greater Columbus. And I just thought, it's so important for us not to just focus on how it is we administer elections, but to ensure that district lines are not manipulated to manipulate the vote. And of course, when you talk about the manipulation of district lines and the manipulation of the vote, you're also talking about the manipulation of public policy. Now, by the time we got to 2005, we had an effort that didn't come together in the late 90s. And we are a state that has a citizen initiative. And I think that's an important tool for reform. So as we're thinking about kind of laboratories of democracy, Ohio is a place where you can collect enough signatures, it's approximately 10% of the gubernatorial vote, and you can put a measure before the voters to support it. And in 2005, this horrible scandal was unveiled. And, Andrew mentioned that I was the head of the Money and Politics Project at that time. In this scandal, Tom Noe, who was a major Republican donor, he'd been appointed by the governor to serve on the Board of Regents. He was essentially able, as a coin dealer, to invest for the state of Ohio for the Bureau of Workers' Compensation. And it turns out what he did is he created a company to basically assess the coins and assess how much they were worth. So he ended up, stealing, between $10 to $15 million of Ohio's money. This scandal really rocked Ohio. And you might say, oh, well, this might be the perfect time for redistricting reform. And we all thought, hey, this is the perfect time to think about how can we address money in politics? How can we address, election administration? Let's talk about redistricting reform. We actually should have really fair voting districts. And so there were a series of ballot measures in 2005, and we got our butts kicked. And what was incredibly, incredibly painful is that the Republican Party opposed it, because at this point we'd gone from Democratic rule to Republican Party rule. The Republican Party opposed it, and I threw in this ad just to give you a sense of the kind of mailers and the things saying we had no family values and all, just the tremendous amount, millions of dollars spent against election reforms. And at the same time, the Democrats were eyeing, there's this horrible scandal. We're going to move into power. Maybe we'll be the one drawing the lines. So what happened is, even though the Republican Party actively opposed it, the Democratic Party was so tepid that there was just a sense, oh, these aren't real reforms, or these aren't needed. And so it was as if both political parties would say, hey, don't vote for this. And it was incredibly painful. But, and I always highlight, every once in a while you fail big, but you fail forward. And what happened in this particular case is there were the most popular ballot measures. And this included 30 days of early in-person voting and no fault absentee voting. And so, in other words, you could vote by mail without having to say you were going to be out of the state or out of the county, or you were too sick to actually vote in person on election day. And so those reforms were incredibly popular. So the Ohio General Assembly, our state legislature, convened in a special session in August, essentially to pass these election reforms. And of course, they continue to be wildly popular. So even though, we lost in 2005, we didn't get all the reforms we wanted, this was a tremendous, success in terms of making it easier for folks to cast a ballot. And many, as we look at what happened during the 2020 election, and we look at, what happened with COVID, we were well prepared for voting, by mail and changing the way that we voted because of this experience. All right, well, we kind of continued with paying really close attention and having hearings and doing all sorts of different activities to highlight the need to address redistricting reform or addressing those voting districts. And what happened in 2011 is we had this idea, okay, we're going to do these map making competitions. We worked with the Midwest Democracy Network and this wonderful foundation called the Joyce Foundation. And we had all sorts of citizens that participated, and they made maps. And, this is before Dave's redistricting app actually existed. We were using the public mapping project that was created by Professor Michael McDonald and some folks from Harvard. And it was a really exciting period, except it didn't actually end up, even though it was a more public process, we weren't able to put as much pressure as we should have during that 2011 map making. And we got some crazy districts. And you'll notice if you go to the top of the map there, you see Congressional District 9, you might have to move, the pictures of the folks that are the panelists, but you can actually see that if you look, Lucas County, where Toledo is, that's the home of Marcy Kaptur. If you go all the way over to Cuyahoga County, which, it's like a long snake on the lake is what we call it. If you go all the way to Cuyahoga County, where Cleveland is, that is where Dennis Kucinich lived. And it was a way to put two Democrats together. And then sometimes people, when they think of Ohio, I hate to say this, they think about Congressman Jim Jordan. Congressman Jim Jordan has a district that goes all the way. If you see here, it looks like a duck. Whoop, I'll have to go on back. It looks like a duck. And so, it starts kind of in this central north, and it works its way almost all the way to the Indiana border with, the tail feathers are there in Mercer County. Just incredible manipulation. Or you look at like the Congressional District 3, it looks like a Rorschach ink blot. And what we later discovered is that the map makers called the place, the hotel room that they made the map in, they called it the bunker. We discovered that they actually changed Congressional District 16. So it's like a tail down here to Stark County. They'd actually changed it because a campaign contributor wanted to be sure that his home was in Congressional District 16, which was at that point represented by Jim Renacci. So all sorts of games. We put together this report highlighting the problems. And then we said, okay, this is the perfect point to collect signatures. And the proposal focused on an independent commission, and it required compact and competitive districts. And we focused on making sure that there was a representational fairness criteria. In other words, we were worried that it wasn't enough to identify, hey, you can't gerrymander. We said, okay, what we want to do is take a metric that political scientists use and say, okay, let's look at the decade and let's look at how Ohioans voted over the decade. And so if, 50% voted Democratic and 50% voted Republican, well, then we shouldn't see districts like the ones that we're looking at right now, which are 12 Republicans and 4 Democrats heading to DC. It should be closer to, it should be closer to even Steven. Not exactly, but it provided a metric. And wow, so much money was spent against us. The Republican Party came out really hard against it. And it was, once again, to not be able to move, not to be able to move towards something that was fair was both incredibly painful and really challenging. But we continued to really push for this reform. And so what happened is we were, how can we put this? I call this the drip, drip, drip of community organizing. We were such a pain in the neck that the state legislature finally said, okay, we actually need to come together as part of our committee process for the Constitutional Modernization Commission. What we will do is we will focus on gerrymandering. And in December 2014, the state legislature passed reform. It kept elected officials in charge, but it said, hey, districts need to be compact. It focused on keeping political subdivisions together as a proxy for keeping communities together. So county, city, township, that you needed to keep those in order as whole as possible. And it was hard won, but we managed to pass this in issue 1 of 2015, won in all 88 counties, and we hit nearly 72% of the vote. Now, you might think, okay, you hit 72% of the vote, folks came together, Democrats, Republicans came together, and it was this moment of like, okay, we actually are going to have good rules in the Ohio Constitution that are going to rein in the worst aspects of gerrymandering. But then they didn't move to actually do Congress. And so what we did is we started collecting signatures again. And at this point, as you're thinking about laboratories of democracy and hardworking advocates, we finally managed to convince the state legislature. So keep in mind, 2015 to 2018, we finally convinced the state legislature that we were serious. At that point, we had collected 20,000 signatures. And we were able to get the state legislature to come to the bargaining table to approve congressional redistricting reform that focused on the rules, on keeping communities together, county, city, township. There was a real focus on, transparency of map making, bipartisan map making, and the notion that, as much as possible, you couldn't draw the district lines to favor or disfavor one political party. And so here we have Sue in Cuyahoga County on her bike. We did a variety of different things to really energize folks, to get them to take this seriously. And issue 1 in 2018 passed by almost 75% of the vote. Now, the tale of redistricting here is long, and it continues to be incredibly sad, because what happened is that the state legislature and the Ohio Redistricting Commission did not, in fact, meet the rules. They just continued to ignore them. And so these maps repeatedly went to the Ohio Supreme Court. They were deemed repeatedly to be unconstitutional because they were partisan gerrymanders that didn't meet that criteria that I talked about, that metric of, representational fairness, sometimes called proportionality. I'm sure that Andrew because he's from the Brennan Center, can tell you more about just the legal challenges. But I just really wanted to highlight that what happened for us is that the Ohio Redistricting Commission that established those state legislative maps, that in fact what happened is that they ended up creating an unconstitutional map. The fifth time they're like, fine, we're just going to do a map. And it was the same as the third map that had already been struck down. And a federal panel ordered Ohio to use this set of maps. In other words, when we go to vote at the beginning of August, we will be voting on maps, voting districts that have been found to be unconstitutional twice. So what should I tell you? So the legal challenges are continuing. So for some people, they say, okay, well, this process, clearly didn't work. These folks are drunk on power, and we need to actually change our mind and start to do an independent citizens commission, which means picking up our clipboards again. And then I also wanted to highlight that we are continuing to do what we can to improve the reforms that got passed to try to defeat that 2005 measure. This is an example, this is Cuyahoga County. This is a line to go into early vote at Cuyahoga County because there's only one location. And so one of the things that we have been doing for years is promoting having more than one location. In this particular case, completely not safe. And then the other thing I just wanted to highlight that, we continue to do as advocates is we encourage people to register to vote. We have online voter registration, but we do not yet have we do not yet have automatic voter registration. And so that tells you a little bit about our struggle to improve things and a little bit about our laboratory of democracy. And with that, I'm going to hand it to Andrew.
Thank you so much. That's a very illuminating story that tells us so much of the good and bad and gives you so many points of frustration. Some of my colleagues at the Brennan Center, as you alluded to, have been involved in some of the litigation there, and it's been both inspiring and frustrating to hear updates, and getting what feels like it should be a big win, and only to have some frustrating structures stand in the way of implementing the reforms. So we're going to turn now to having a discussion amongst the panelists over this last 15 to 20 minutes we have left. I have a lot of things I want to ask and a lot of things I want to follow up on. So I wish we had a lot more time, but the one thing above all else I want to make sure we get to and give the audience a chance to hear from some experts on is what is the one thing the average person could do to help ensure free and fair elections and defend our democracy? And so in any order you want to go, if you could please start with that one.
Well, I'll throw out my 2 cents. The most obvious thing is vote. If they vote and vote in every election, and they get their friends to vote and other like-minded people who believe in democracy to vote, we can overcome a lot of the difficulties. I think civic education is the key to all of these things. There is probably a big chunk of voters that we've lost, and we've lost forever because they've consumed mis and disinformation, and they're just, not going to be a part of the honest portrayal of elections. But the vast majority of people do believe in elections and do believe that their role is important. And as long as they continue to do their form of participation, we should be okay.
I've been thinking a lot about Tim Snyder, who's written about the rise of authoritarianism in Eastern Europe and commented on how that compares to what's going on in the US now. And one of the things that he said that has stuck with me is to pick an institution and defend it. And in that, I include defending it by also pushing to make it better, in the same way that our patriotism should include pushing to make our country better, but that with the stress that is being placed on our election systems, but not just there, on our media, on so many of the rights for so many vulnerable people, I think the most important thing is to not get overwhelmed by what can feel like sort of cascading crises. Pick something that you care about, that you feel like you could make a difference, that you see in your community, and, and direct your work there and network with everyone working on all the other things, but pick your thing, and don't get so overwhelmed that you pick nothing.
Well, and I really encourage people to find a way to both register people to vote and also to figure out a way to get engaged. So there are different levels of open, what you think of sunshine law or open meetings law and open records law, but we, as much as possible, it's not enough for things to be transparent. We actually have to go to things. So the whole notion of, go to your board of election meetings. If you're super interested in what's happening, with the local sewer system, or there are a variety of different ways to actually get involved. So I highly encourage that. I also think, seriously, find a way to have fun. We do these kind of postcards. So this is from before, but where, we encourage people to do that. And I also think we're a state where we elect judges. And yes, okay. So, if you can imagine, we're a state where you elect judges. So, there's been efforts over the years to actually change that, but clearly making sure that people know the importance of these elections, because they're going to happen in November, whether we change it or not. And any of the states that have that, I really do encourage folks. We spend a lot of time thinking about the U.S. Supreme Court. I encourage us all to be paying close attention to our own Supreme Courts.
That's a great point. And state courts are becoming so much more important, as I've mentioned, the top federal courts are kind of retrenching from enforcing rights. It makes the role of state courts all the more important. One thing I'll just tag on to all those great suggestions and insights is sign up to be a poll worker if you have it in you. They're so important. They do so much to make elections run. It's a hard time for poll workers. I won't tell you otherwise. But we're so appreciative of what they do. And if that's something you think you want to do, I can only encourage you. One thing that
Especially if you're, I'm sorry, I was just going to say,
please.
especially if you live in a community where you are in the minority of that political representation, sometimes you can feel kind of powerless if you're a Republican in a Democratic city or a Democrat in a Republican city. You're exactly the poll worker that they need, because so many places require partisan balance and struggle to get it. That's something we've really, we've had people who want to be poll workers get turned away because there are too many of their party and not enough of the other party.
That's great. No, I definitely agree with that. And Anna, one of the things you talked about during your presentation was building trust with the community and elections. And that's something I want to ask a bit more about. And I'm curious, amongst everyone, what are some of the reforms you've seen in your states or elsewhere that have been most successful in building that trust? And I'm going to make it a multi-part question. What are the barriers you're continuing to see between the system as it is and voters having appropriate trust in their system? And I think, Catherine, we kind of see from what you talked about and how money gets involved and how we see these reforms not being implemented in ways that seem common sense, how they should be. So I'd appreciate hearing all your insights on that.
Well, I can say that I think that money in politics is probably the biggest source of distrust in Maine, and that along with that, I think we would be remiss to not say that for so many voters, looking at the systems that have been built up in our country, they were built for property holding white men. And it's been a struggle for everyone else to get their rights. And in a lot of cases, still deeply a struggle, and people don't have their rights. And so facing, we have to also look at that history when we think about, distrust isn't a new thing for a lot of communities. It's based on, centuries of, not being included. The other thing that I think where I would say more positively, where we see trust get built is with transparency. And because this just happened this week, I'll mention that Maine, ranked choice voting, the process for counting a ranked choice voting race can be really complicated. And our state has really led the way in terms of having every piece of that be live streamed, be explained, be incredibly transparent. If somebody makes a mistake, like copying the wrong line in an Excel spreadsheet, which they did once on the live stream, they explain it and fix it in real time. And it's gone a long way toward reassuring voters that the system works. And we've just seen the Portland city clerk, who kind of was resisting doing that initially, has now herself taken on, a live stream of the local events and telling people when those are going to happen. And while only a tiny number of voters actually goes and watches it, those are the people who are the most likely to think, oh, wait, something suspicious is going on here because my candidate didn't. It's all right there for them to see. And it has made a big difference for us in building trust in a system that, because it's new and confusing at times, could have been really dangerous from that perspective.
I'm just going to throw out something that's, so obviously I shared a tale of us all losing even more trust, right? However, one of the things that really helped build trust was the voter verified paper audit trails on our machines. So, and we've had them for a while, but even the reminding people that they actually exist and reminding, that seems to help people. Because we have many counties, I would say about half of our counties vote on touchscreen machines. And so that voter verified paper audit trail becomes incredibly important. And it goes back, to 2006 when Ken Blackwell was, suggesting he would bring things home for some of his favorite people.
That's all really great insight again. And one question I want to ask, relatedly both to the advocates and election administrators on here, is how you deal with elections becoming more polarized, and how do you talk to people when they think, your role as an election, a voting rights advocate or an election administrator is somehow partisan, because the things we're talking about, automatic voter registration, that's not partisan, right? But it's become more polarized, and that's been a pretty recent development. Some people on here may be aware, in 2006, the Senate reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, or Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act, I should say, to vote in the Senate 98-0. And of course, it's not to say voting rights in our country have a long history of being perfectly bipartisan, and it's been a long and difficult struggle, but it's really been something in the last few years that's accelerated. So how is that something you deal with, especially when you talk to the public?
Okay, well, I'll throw out my 2 cents here. It's hard to talk to the public. It used to be easy, but over the last couple of years, it's become much harder. I personally have spent hours and hours and hours talking to people who have doubts about the system. Occasionally you get through to somebody, you give them facts and data, and you direct them to places where they can get good information. But a lot of people are pretty fixed with their opinions, and it doesn't really matter how right you are. They believe what they believe. And I'll tell you a little story. I'm on Facebook, and I have many friends from way back when I was in high school and before that. I grew up in a little town in western Kansas. I grew up on a farm. So I have a whole bunch of friends that I went to middle school and high school and even college. And one of them was promoting a bunch of election lies after the election. And I kind of sat on my hands for a while. And then finally, I reached out to her directly and said, hey, I'm in elections, right? And we're old friends. I mean, we were very good friends. And I asked if she would like to talk to me and, talk through some of these concerns. And she said no, but then she kept reposting. And so finally I convinced her to call me, and we ended up speaking for over an hour. And I walked her through a whole bunch of different things. And, you throw out questions, I'm going to answer them. And I talked to her about this problem and that, suspicion, and we just went through them. And at the end of the hour plus that we talked, she was like, well, I just really appreciate that you took time to talk to me about this. And boy, you have all this great data and so forth. And I said, well, okay, that's great. But are you dissuaded from these sort of election denier ideas? And she said, well, truthfully, I think, you're an honest person and you're trying to do your best. But I just wonder if the wool has been pulled over your eyes, and that all these other people are out there gaming it and you just don't realize it. And I said, well, but I explained to you why that's not possible. And we do all these things. And she was like, I just don't believe you. And I just had to say, well, that's the end of our friendship. You know that, right? And she was like, well, sorry. So she went on, we ended the call. A couple weeks later, she posted another sort of crazy election theory, and I unfriended her. And I think it's a sad statement, but I think that that's where we are with a lot of people out there. And I personally believe that those people are lost. We are not going to get those people. And we need to concentrate on the people that are teetering or the people that are on the edges and try to get them back from the precipice and do our best to engage them and tell them all the right information so that we can save them. And then also get 17-year-olds on board, get 16-year-olds on board, teach elections in high school, because then they'll enter adulthood with a basic understanding of how this stuff works.
That's an amazing and very sad story. And I think you're very much not alone in having those experiences. And we are hearing that there are election officials who have left, town clerks who have left and don't want to do it anymore because they're facing hostility from people who used to trust them. And I also think that while those are the loudest voices, there are a lot of people who are, like you're saying, who are sitting there not fully engaged, but just sort of wondering in the back of their minds, is there something that I should be worried about here? And I think where we often struggle with, at least I do, is that in some ways, they're right. In some ways, the politicians are out for themselves. In some way, these systems don't work as well as they should. And they're also trustworthy at a fundamental level in terms of who is administering your elections and the systems and safeguards that are in place. And how can we kind of hold both truths? Because I think if we tell people there's nothing wrong, then a lot of people who could be reached will tune out. So that's the sort of trying to hold both of those somewhat contradictory ideas is a challenge, I think, as an advocate, when we want to push for better, while also not undermining confidence in what we have. And I think, again, clerks can be incredibly powerful messengers there. And like I said, in Maine, with our 540 small, clerks, we've got clerks for towns of 50 people. They're incredibly valuable messengers. And so we just hired someone whose job is entirely going to be doing outreach to those clerks and trying to connect them better to each other, better to experts, better to people who can help them figure out, best practices in talking about this stuff, all of that, because, they've been neglected for a long time. And sometimes we complain about their, still using Windows 95, but on the other hand, they're maybe the ones who can save us.
Well, that's really great, and I appreciate that. And then there's a lot more I wish I could ask and we could discuss, but we've come up on time. So I think I have to cut us off there. But thank you so much to fellow panelists who are all absolutely brilliant and give such great information at the state level and such great insight onto what the state of voting and elections looks like around our country. And a big thank you to everyone who tuned in tonight. Hopefully it was interesting and informative. And if Bryce or Claudia have anything else to say, I'll turn it over to them. Otherwise, thank you so much for having me, and I wish everyone a good night.
So we're just going to say goodnight. Thank you so much. You all were amazing. It was a great night. Thank you. Good
Thanks.
night, everybody.
Thanks. See ya.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.